So the last AMD notebook that I remember checking out was the ASUS ROG G14. It was a spectacular machine that had excellent performance because it was one of the first laptops to hit the market with an 8-core 16-thread processor from AMD, the Ryzen 9 CPU. It had a really unique design, excellent battery life. The performance really did put some of the Intel notebooks to shame. And the price was also a steal considering what you were getting. It honestly was an awesome laptop. By the way, if you're interested in my full review, you can check it out right over here. Now, what I have in front of me is the ASUS TUF A15. It's a slightly more affordable option than the G14, but what's really interesting is that the specs between the two are pretty similar, but this laptop does cut corners in build quality, I/O, and a few other things. On paper, when you compare this to the G14, really the only difference is the CPU and the GPU. Well, sorta. So you're getting an 8-core 16-thread Ryzen 7 4800H that has a higher TDP than the Ryzen 9 4900HS on the G14. Also, the base and boost frequencies are lower on the Ryzen 7 CPU. The GPU on the TUF notebook is an RTX 2060 non-Max-Q versus Max-Q variant on the G14. The rest of the specs are basically the same. However, the price difference is pretty significant. This TUF laptop is $250 cheaper than the G14, which is actually a lot. The starting price of this laptop is $700, and for that, you get a Ryzen 5 CPU, 8GB of RAM, and a GTX 1650. You can configure it up to the specs that I have on my sample right over here, but watch out for a few SKUs that ASUS is offering. Some of them have a smaller battery along with a dedicated 2.5-inch hard drive bay. So with that out of the way, let's get into the physical aspects of this laptop, then get into performance compared to the G14 and find out if it's worth getting over some of the other options that are currently in the market. Starting with exterior impressions, and I'm just gonna say that I'm in love with this sleek sandstone matte gray finish. ASUS is calling it Fortress Gray. It's an aluminum lid with plastic bits on the inside, so it doesn't feel as premium as a G14, but it is a day and night difference compared to the GA502DU that I checked out last year from ASUS, which was also an AMD-based notebook. They're also offering a bonfire black design, which also looks cool, but I personally like the gray. You just get this utilitarian vibe when you look at this thing, especially with that TUF logo engraved on the center, along with some other design cues that just complete that stealth look. I really like it. The webcam is located at the top with a small bump on the lid. The nice thing about this is that it allows you to easily open the laptop with just one hand. Nice touch, ASUS. The hinge unfortunately wobbles a lot, so definitely watch out for that when you have this on your lap, typing up something. It does get quite distracting. I was also surprised by the fact that this hardly showed any fingerprints, so that's definitely a bonus. There is a bit of flex on the lid, particularly in the center, and I expected that because this ain't a unibody design. That would cost you more money. Things do take an interesting turnaround when you open that lid because this interior space just does not reflect the low profile look from the outside. It just screams gamery and I'm not a fan of it. I think ASUS was trying too hard to compensate for the plastic materials being used here by going with a brushed texture. I actually prefer the sandstone finish on the ROG GA502DU. In fact, the interior looks way better on that versus this TUF laptop. You're getting a full-size keyboard with ROG fonts on the keycaps. The arrow keys are minuscule compared to the rest, so it might be a problem for people with larger hands. The keys themselves feel good. They do have a bit of travel distance, but feel a bit mushy. I'm not sure if it's due to the plastic body, but it's certainly not as good as a G14. The WASD keys are translucent, which is kind of unique because you can see the switches underneath, but it just kills the consistency. I assume gamers appreciate this separation. RGB lighting has made its way into the keyboard. The illumination with the WASD keys do look a bit weird, especially when compared to the rest of the keyboard. It's bright enough to get you through those night gaming sessions. Honestly, I just wished if they were all the same, but let me know in the comments down below. Do you guys prefer having a separated WASD key layout versus the other way around? I'm curious to know. The trackpad is surprisingly really good for the price point. It is a smooth plastic finish, which really helps navigating through windows easily. It's actually better than the Aero series on Gigabyte laptops, which was surprising to me. It's not a glass surface like what you'll find on more expensive premium notebooks out there, but it gets the job done. It also has support for Windows precision drivers, which is nice. And something that this notebook reminded me of is just how amazing dedicated primary left and right buttons were. We're slowly starting to see integrated ones, but this has dedicated buttons and they're awesome. I mean, just take a listen for yourself. I can just do this all day. I would totally do this all day. If that was my job, I would do it. Though that would be pretty boring, but I would still do it. So this is the webcam test on the TUF A15. The video quality is obviously not the greatest, but the microphone sounds pretty good. You will notice a lot of compression with my voice, but it does a pretty good job isolating the background noise, so that's nice. The speakers are bottom facing, but ASUS pulled a really smart move by adding cutouts on the side, resulting in twice the sound output compared to previous generations. And I've got to say, these sound pretty amazing. The bass is deep because the sound bounces back to the chassis, especially when you have it laid out flat on a desk. The highs are nice and detailed, but they do tend to become harsh sometimes. But for casual or general listening purposes, this thing will exceed your expectations. It's actually better than my Blade 15. Port selection is decent, but there are a few questionable choices. Most of them are on the left-hand side, starting with power in, LAN port, HDMI 2.0, two USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports, a Type-C 3.2 Gen 2 that also supports DisplayPort 1.4 with G-Sync, and an audio jack. Switching over to the right, you get a single USB 2 port. That's right. I don't know why. I'm not sure if it's even legal to ship notebooks in 2020 with a USB 2 port. Also keep in mind that those two Type A ports on the left-hand side are 5 gigabits per second versus 10 gigabits per second, which is the updated spec. I mean, I guess this is an area where ASUS had to cut corners, so it is what it is. Moving on to the display, it's a 15.6-inch IPS level with 144 Hz that also supports adaptive sync. Unfortunately, it isn't the most color accurate screen because it only covers 64% sRGB, 48% Adobe RGB, and 47% DCI-P3. So if you're a content creator or a photographer, you should probably stay away from this notebook. The viewing angles are nice and there is good contrast. I didn't experience any backlit bleed on my sample, and the screen only gets as bright as 300 nits, so outdoor visibility will be a bit challenging. But with that being said, the gaming experience on the TUF A15 was absolutely amazing, and that's thanks to the 144 Hz refresh rate. If you're a hardcore gamer, you wouldn't necessarily prioritize color accuracy. What really matters is that you get a smooth, stutter-free experience, and this thing delivers. Upgrading is super easy on this laptop. All you have to do to get inside is use a Phillips head screwdriver to undo the custom pop-open screws, and bam, you've got easy access to 2 RAM slots. Supported maximum capacity is 32 gigabytes. The NVMe SSD is right over here, and there is an additional M.2 slot for expansion, which is very thoughtful of ASUS to include. The SSD that comes with this notebook is not the fastest that I've seen, but interestingly enough, it edges out the G14. Perhaps the most exciting feature of this TUF notebook is the battery life, because it just blew all of our minds away. It is absolutely insane. Mike, Dimitri, and myself, we were just in awe looking at the numbers, because it's magical. You see, ASUS has crammed a 90 watt-hour battery inside this thing, and as we all know, the power efficiency that comes with AMD's Zen 2 architecture is an engineering marvel. So on our light load test, this laptop lasted the longest among our other gaming laptops, including the G14. I mean, more than 10 hours of light use is ultra-book category, which is just nuts. Switching over to our heavy load test, running real bench on a loop, this just surpassed our expectations. Finally, let's get into the meat and potatoes of this video, performance. And I think you're in here for a surprise. Now, just like every other notebook, we did test the TUF A15 with its built-in performance mode enabled. And as we ran our synthetic test to set a baseline, we noticed that the Ryzen 7 4800H was noticeably faster than the Ryzen 9 4900HS on the G14. It was pretty clear on our multi-core tests like Cinebench R15 and R20. It also goes to show how far behind Intel is, even with their 8-core 16-thread offerings. Meanwhile, single-core saw both AMD-based systems tied, and as usual, this is an area where Intel takes the edge. But before I get into real-world tests, I do want to explain something really quickly. Like we saw in our temperature and frequencies over time, along with Cinebench results, the A15's thicker body basically allowed ASUS to cram in a really good cooling solution. That means the Ryzen 7 4800H is able to consistently hit higher frequencies in multi-core loads than the 4900HS in the Zephyrus G14. Basically, that should mean it'll gain a performance advantage by sacrificing weight and size versus G14 in most cases, but not every time. Now, in order to see how this notebook behaves when it comes to clock speeds, let's look at Maya render using every core at 100% over the course of 10 minutes. As you can see, temperatures climb up to around 88 degrees Celsius before falling off a cliff and stabilizing over 70 degrees. Why is this happening? Well, you can see some hints as we add clock speeds to this. So basically, it looks like this 4800H boosts high for the first 2 minutes and 30 seconds of the test at 3.6 GHz, but then AMD's algorithms step things down to 3.1 GHz. That's still a really respectable clock speed, but it didn't change no matter how much cooling we threw at it. This is probably because it reached a power threshold. Moving on to gaming, and here's where things get really interesting. Since Doom Eternal puts a multi-core but not full-core load on the CPU, the power limit gets avoided so temperatures are able to remain pretty high. This is also because the GPU is working at full load, so every internal components get impacted. Unlike the Maya test, this situation means a gradual decrease in clock speeds rather than them falling off a cliff. For this game, it translates to about 3.35 GHz as a constant after 10 minutes or so, which is pretty respectable. As for GPU temperatures, well, they were really kept below NVIDIA's throttling thresholds throughout the test. This also goes to show how good ASUS's cooling assembly is. And moving on to the actual clock speeds, those leveled out at about 1550 MHz, which is actually well above NVIDIA's stated boost clock of 1200 MHz for this graphics card. What that means is that there's thermal headroom that's being taken advantage of, allowing the RTX 2060 to hit higher than the spec frequencies. So let's jump into the real-world tests. And yeah, man, this Ryzen 7 CPU just loves to flex its muscles. It's honestly not funny at this point. Zen's capabilities with its increased IPC and blistering fast multi-core performance ace this Blender test in record time. The same story goes with DaVinci Resolve. The higher TDP on this Ryzen 7 CPU does allow it to maintain higher clock speeds for longer, which results in faster exports versus the G14. I also want to mention that this is a very GPU-focused renderer, so the RTX 2060 is at a disadvantage versus the RTX 2070s and the 2080s, the Intel machines we have come with. It's also why the A15's non-Max-Q version takes the edge in the AMD versus AMD comparison. Switching over to Premiere, with the new update leveraging NVIDIA and AMD GPUs, export times have become faster. So now the AMD systems are really competitive, but Intel takes the edge here, and the reason for that is pretty interesting. Even though the new Premiere update leverages GPU horsepower, it doesn't use both the discrete NVIDIA card and AMD's integrated graphics alongside one another. Meanwhile, on the Intel system, it still uses QuickSync and the discrete card to boost performance even further. If you use Handbrake for transcoding, this Ryzen CPU is fast. Most certainly faster than Intel by a long shot. And wrapping things up with our compression test using WinRAR, it lines up with our expectations. Basically, this CPU is super impressive, guys, and it can keep up with anything and everything you throw at it, whether if it's compiling code, rendering, you name it. Gaming also favored the TUF notebook when compared to the G14. As you can see with Tomb Raider, Far Cry 5, Rainbow Six Siege, and Overwatch, the sustained higher clock speeds on the CPU along with the non-Max-Q RTX 2060 pushed out frame rates that were much higher than the G14 at 1080p set to the highest settings. But let's also not forget, the G14 is significantly smaller than the TUF notebook and is thinner too, so the frame rates that it yields are also respectable. It'll be certainly interesting to see where things fall if or when AMD notebooks are even paired with higher-end GPUs. But for now, they deliver an awesome combination of 1080p performance with really good pricing. Now moving on a bit, I decided to also test the performance with ASUS's Turbo mode enabled. And the increase was very minimal over the standard performance mode versus the epic amount of noise it produced. Honestly, I just stick to the standard mode and not even venture into Turbo because it just sounds like a jet fan. Surface temps are okay under heavy gaming sessions. The only area you need to watch out for is the top right-hand side because it does become a hotspot, and that might be an issue if you're gaming for longer sessions with an external mouse. So I think it's time to conclude my thoughts on the TUF A15 gaming laptop. And guys, I've got to give it to ASUS for delivering a really fast machine for $1,200. The performance is absolutely amazing. It just puts some of the most expensive offerings from Intel to shame when it comes to CPU-intensive workloads. That Ryzen 7 CPU, it loves to flex, man. It's fast. That's the only thing I can say. It actually is faster than the Ryzen 9 4900HS on the G14, but that's also because ASUS was able to cram in a really good cooling solution. And also, you are, of course, sacrificing on the weight and size compared to that laptop. Now, when it comes to gaming, it's certainly not the fastest machine out there, especially when compared to notebooks with higher-end GPUs. that RTX 2060 does come at a disadvantage, but it still gets the job done at 1080p for the most part. I just really wish to see higher end GPUs paired with AMD CPUs. I'm not even sure if that's going to happen anytime soon, but if it does, that would make history. I really like the exterior design of the A15. As I mentioned earlier, it looks utilitarian, which obviously goes along with the TUF branding, but the interior design, man, it just kills me. It looks gamery. It doesn't really align with the exterior design of this laptop. And if you're willing to get over that, that's okay. You can definitely pick this up. It's a great option. You are compromising on a few things like build quality because for the most part, it is a plastic chassis, except for the lid. The hinge is not quite strong. It does wobble a lot. And the display is not color accurate. So if that's something that you value, you should probably look elsewhere. Though, given that this is geared towards gamers, if you look at it from that perspective, this thing delivers because of that 144 Hertz refresh rate. Finally, the I/O. It's not up to spec. You're not getting the fastest USB 3.2 Gen 2. The fact that it has a USB 2 port. These are certainly some things to keep in mind. And finally, I should mention that this does not have a Wi-Fi 6 module. So it really depends on how you value that as well. But overall, for the price, I'm impressed. I'm seriously impressed. I think the performance is what is the most exciting thing about the TUF A15. It's the fastest machine that we've ever encountered compared to the Intel offerings that we have, which is kind of awesome. So on that note, thank you so much for watching. Let us know what you think of the A15 from ASUS. And if you're shopping around for a laptop within this price range, would you consider this? Let me know in the comments down below. I'm Ibor with hardwarecanucks. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, my friends, and spend responsibly, because that's more important, right? I'll see you guys in the next one.